of the Sabbath of the undead, I call upon you to witness my supreme triumph.
Check it out, it's Radio Free Infinite, episode 363, in between Kraftwerk episodes. And I still had plenty of cool metal stuff planned, but it turns out those episodes are going to need a bit more research. So I figured I'd cover a band this week that I'm really familiar with, that I don't need to do any research at all on, because I'm incredibly lazy.
Time for a nap. I'm a cat who loves to snooze.
And also because people have actually been requesting that I talk about this band for years, so better late than never. We're talking about Electric Wizard, a band whose albums you probably bought right when you got into metal, and they're probably sitting on the pile right next to those early Nile albums in terms of stuff that you haven't paid attention to in a while, because, I don't know, you think you've outgrown them, you think you're too cool, but you really should be listening to them regularly, because at their best, they're fantastic and absolutely essential. Now, I know some of you people out there, you hear Electric Wizard, you start getting a little sleepy. Like, hey, yo, Jub, why are you talking about that beardo hipster crap? I'm here to tell you that you only think that
because you're gay.
When they're at their best, Electric Wizard are fantastic. From the guitar tone, to how the drums sound, to the riffs themselves, to even the samples that they choose to utilize.
When you get into one of these groups, there's only a couple ways you can get out. One is death, the other is mental institutions.
This here is...
God damn it!
The first track on their most famous album, Dopethrone. It is entitled Venum Sabathi, and it displays inside of 3 minutes pretty much everything you can expect from the best of Electric Wizard. Namely that being an absolutely massive guitar playing absolutely massive riffs. Still to this day, one of the heaviest bands of all time. A lot of people would just say, yeah, it's stoner doom, but I think it kind of transcends that label a bit. I would put this album and the rest of the other Electric Wizard albums that built up to it in kind of its own ad hoc style, along with bands like Conan, Church of Misery, the Third Sleep album, the more extreme moments of Reverend Bizarre, Oro Druin, and Gates of Slumber as playing something one might call extreme doom metal. You know, some of these bands, they cross over into stoner territory or sludge territory, maybe some drone elements, but it's just a lot heavier than what you can generally expect from either of those genres, while at the same time, it's not really death metal or even funeral doom metal. It's the basic heavy metal doom metal template, but everything is turned up and exaggerated to the point where it becomes its own form of extreme metal. And Electric Wizard, by the time they got around to their third album, had essentially perfected that style. But their coming around to this sort of extreme doom metal is a rather interesting story in itself, because much like their sort of immediate stylistic precursor, Cathedral, these guys had their roots in actual extreme metal. In this case, a short-lived doomy death metal band called Lord of Putrefaction, way back in the late 80s and early 90s. Although technically they also put out a demo before that as Morbicus, but I can't for the life of me find that fucking demo, and it's not on the handy dandy pre-Electric Wizard 1989 to 1994 compilation. So we're starting off with Lord of Putrefaction to find the roots of Electric Wizard's extremity. If you haven't heard it before, I would highly recommend the Wings Over a Black Funeral demo. If you're into old school, crusty, nasty sounding death metal with a hefty element of doom to it, real chunky riffs, excellent sense of groove, and even a little bit of the unexpected. I mean, check out these dang keyboards. I feel like we're listening to an Infestor song. And in fact, I'm willing to bet if Infestor had decided to go the trad doom route, they might have sounded a lot like Electric Wizard later on in life. There's also quite a bit of grindcore, much like, you know, Lee Dorian from Cathedral before he formed Cathedral. He's the vocalist for Napalm Death. But the grindcore in this case isn't hyper-fast, political, thrashy stuff. It's nasty, crepitant gore grind that very much slots in well against all of the doom metal and death metal. I'm pretty positive that if Lord of Putrefaction had managed to get a full-length album out, it would have been up there with stuff like Autopsy and Winter in terms of death doom mastery, but that wasn't what history had in store. tour for this group of musicians. So Lord of Putrefaction exists for about a year or two. Eventually they changed their name to Thy Grief Eternal, but are still playing the same general kind of stuff. But then Justin Oborn, the main mastermind behind the band, took a bunch of mushrooms, listened to a bunch of Black Sabbath, and had something of a revelation.
Aliens fucked over the carbonator in inch number 4. I'm gonna try to refuculate it and land on Juniper, and hopefully you got some space weed over. How's that, buddy? I don't fucking know.
Ricky, that's not very good. Use space words, real ones, not talking about space weed.
Much like Lee Dorian had when he kind of got sick of the grindcore scene and started listening to a bunch of Pentagram. He changes the name of the band to just Eternal and puts out one last demo in 1993 entitled Lucifer's Children. And boom, you get extreme doom metal. Aesthetically, especially in terms of guitar tone, it's got a lot in common with stuff like Entombed. But in terms of overall songwriting, it's essentially just old school doom metal made more extreme. Heavier, more gross, fuzzy, nasty. If somehow Witchfinder General turned into a death metal band, they might have ended up sounding like this. They've even got real nasty breakdowns, sections like this. And unsurprisingly, Lee Dorian from Cathedral was highly impressed by this stuff, and once they got their name changed to Electric Wizard, he signed them to his Rise Above label for their debut self-titled album, which, perhaps somewhat unfairly, is often ignored by Electric Wizard fans nowadays. It might not be as crazy as something like Come My Fanatics, but I listened to it all the way through for the first time in a while, several times during my research process for this episode, and I gotta say, if this was the only Electric Wizard album, they'd still be remembered as a pretty classic band. You've got these monstrous, incredibly riff-heavy rocking songs like Stone Magnet, not that far off from Cathedral's Force of Equilibrium, which I'm completely okay with, because that's by far my favorite Cathedral album. And I wish there was more stuff that sounded like it, even from Cathedral themselves. I mean, they even used the exact same cover artist as Cathedral's Forest of Equilibrium for this album. And it absolutely fits this album's atmosphere. Probably the closest they ever got to sounding whimsical, particularly on riff variation sections like this. Nice little alternate universe version of the main opening riff of the song. But this coexists with a crepitant sense of darkness. Not to the point where it becomes funeral doom or death doom, but certainly heavier than your average happy-go-lucky stoner band. Hence, extreme doom metal. Even if it doesn't quite sound like their later material, that style is in full effect on this release. Another Electric Wizard staple that starts with this album is their incorporation of space rock, specifically a lot of Hawkwind influence that would become very important for Electric Wizard going forward. Funnily enough, on this album, it actually comes out of them kind of taking the Planet Caravan or Solitude style of Black Sabbath song and just making it way more heavy and a lot weirder and spaced out sounding. Songs like this also take full advantage of the fact that this band is a three-piece. It's got guitars, drums, and bass, and through their utilization of those materials, they're able to craft these sort of soundscapes and give each instrument its day in the sun. In fact, in many ways, this is the most balanced sounding Electric Wizard album in that regard. My favorite song on this album, Behemoth, actually combines these two approaches, the very riff-heavy, cathedral-esque material, and the spaced-out Hawkwind shit. The main riff that you're hearing on this song right now is another really good example of extreme doom metal. It's based in Black Sabbath, but it's got heaviness that's on par with any doom metal or black metal riff, at least to my ear, maybe not yours. Check out this Iomi trill. And like the Eternal demo, Lucifer's Children, this one also features very crushing sort of breakdown section. But in the case of this song, this breakdown is used as sort of a springboard to jump off into outer space and incorporate some of those weirder, spacier elements. You could also see sections like this as being an evolution of the odd keyboard-heavy sections from the Lord of Putrefaction days. They would very much be an important component of Electric Wizard sounds going forward. Also, like that weird echoed guitar feedback noise in the background reminds me a lot of early St. Vitus, which, as you're no doubt aware if you've been watching this channel for a while, I am a giant fan of everything that band's done. Also, this bass fill right here is super cool. And it leads us into the unfolding of a more heavy metal response to that breakdown section that harkens back to the breakdown riff that introduced the whole thing. Really clever songwriting on this album, excellent bit of doom metal, but Electric Wizard themselves were not pleased with the result. They said that they were listening to the engineer's advice a bit too much instead of recording the way they actually wanted to record.
Queero Fagnu. Oh my God, I'm going to tell everyone that's your name now. I might even say it at the State of the Union.
And on the follow-up album, Come My Fanatics, they took a much more direct approach to creative control in the studio, and as such, you're not going to be surprised to learn that it ended up being a lot heavier.
You're all the same, the lot of you, with your long hair and faggot clothes. Drugs, sex, every sort of filth. And you hate the police, don't you?
You make it easy.
This album doesn't lumber necessarily so much as it oozes. I mean, watch how the band comes in here. Apparently, when Lee Dorrian got the advanced tapes for this album, he had a moment very similar to when Peaceful got Darkthrone's A Blaze in the Northern Sky with that massive style change. He was like, what is even going on here? It's so noisy, I could barely hear the drums. But credit to Lee Dorrian. He then proceeded to get incredibly stoned, lie down and listen to it on his bed, and it all made sense to him. I mean, this is incredibly extreme doom metal, perhaps the apotheosis of that style. Even the more boogie-heavy Black Sabbath-esque sections like this, they got those bluesy pentatonics and everything. But it's got very little in common aesthetically with any sort of hard rock stuff, outside of the scales being utilized. The approach and cadence almost has more in common with a band like Hellhammer on a song like Triumph of Death than it does with Black Sabbath, particularly when they get into the really nasty breakdown sections like this one. Just this primal creature of darkness screaming out, tunneling further into the void. Even the vocals have massively changed from their first album and their demos, where they were a little more Ozzy-esque. Now he's just maniacal, howling, echoing creature. And you even get the bluesy, Iommi-esque explorations, but they're given that extra space rock kick to go into more extra-dimensional, exploratory territory. Cosmic serpents worming their way through the blackened void. And kind of like with their self-titled album, if this had been the last thing they ever put out, I still think Electric Wizard would have been remembered as a classic band. But fortunately for all you maniacs out there, there was another 3 years of insanity where they were getting arrested for knocking over liquor stores, breaking into churches. They were jumping off of shit and snapping their clavicles, just going completely insane. And at the end of all of it, we get the third Electric Wizard album, Dopethrone. Unquestionably their magnum opus. I mean, if you don't know the song Funeralopolis,
what happened? Your balls drop off?
I guarantee this shit is gonna blow your mind. This song comes oozing out of the chaotic, noisy end of that Weenam Sabathi song we started the episode out with these pentatonic, semi-improvised guitar and bass figures kind of weaving around, emerging from the chaos to assert a new blackened form of order to an uncaring universe. And then it happens. They hit you with that fucking riff. You probably know it. And it's just this outpouring of hate and misanthropy that again can only be described as extreme in the same way that death metal and black metal and funeral doom and all that other stuff is, but without losing that traditional doom metal essence. And then something even cooler fucking happens. Contrary to form, they actually speed up. And it might just be the heaviest shit ever. This kind of thing you can only really hear in extreme doom. It's not exactly sludgy, it's not death metal-y. It has that classic Sabbathic aura to it, but it's just way more insane sounding, particularly when they start incorporating all this crazy space rock shit with the distorted vocals. There's really nothing else like this style of music being done properly, which is what these guys proceed to do. for all hour and 16 minutes of this album. I mentioned Black Sabbath a lot, but in some ways, this album is actually a repudiation of certain aspects of Black Sabbath. According to the booklets on the reissue that I own, the song We Hate You at the end of the album was explicitly a response to all the peace and love stuff that Ozzy was always jawing about. Electric Wizard says, fuck that. We don't love you. We don't wish the best for you. We fucking hate you. And you know what? When I listen to this fucking riff, I could believe them. Just like, what a masterpiece of guitar playing this is. Down to the guitar tone, the individual note choices, everything. Follow-up riff is classic too. This whole song has this pretty lengthy instrumental beginning before we even get into any like vocals and verses. This buildup of hatred, like a brewing cosmic stomach ache, and they're gonna shit misanthropy all over your face. Lyrics on this song in particular, but honestly for the whole album, are fantastic. Go and look them up. Absolutely matching the misanthropic tone of the music underneath all of it. And then you get into this really clever bit of songwriting where they bring in that lead guitar, and you know he's gonna say, we hate you.
Come on, say the N-word. Say the N-word. Come on, I want you to say the N-word. Ah!
But the way he weaves that lyrical line into the overall rhythmic structure of the music is actually rather clever. Utilizing some negative space to kind of follow that lead guitar line. Very memorable moment on this album. I consider it to be the climax of all their efforts on putting forward that sort of hatred in musical form. And likewise, I would consider Dopethrone to be one of the greatest doom metal albums of all time, unmatched to this day, even by the band themselves. In fact, this album, Dopethrone, and the album after it, Let Us Pray, I would consider to be the last original Electric Wizard albums. And by that I mean the last ones with the OG lineup, the three-piece, the space rock, all that sort of thing. It ends after 2002, and in fact, 2004's album We Live is actually credited to Electric Wizard Mark II in the liner notes.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
I do like Electric Wizard in their latter years, at least on the We Live in Witch Cult Today albums. Those are pretty good, but it's not really the same Electric Wizard that people came to love with Dopethrone. However, the intermittent album between those eras, Let Us Pray, the last one with the OG lineup, a lot of people hate this one. I actually find it to be heavily underrated. I mean, you can't really make a Dopethrone part 2. People are just gonna call you
flat out fucking poo.
So they wisely decided to do something a little different for this album. It's a much noisier affair. A lot of it is even more aggressive and hateful than Dopethrone was, particularly on the shorter songs. The faster parts still have that sort of Sabbathy, almost boogie rock bluesiness to it, but watch what they do with that shit.
Damn, that's hateful.
It's just so dissonant and strange and noisy, but it's still got that same Electric Wizard style, really clever songwriting with these interesting riffs kind of bouncing off each other. Like, I actually get this song in particular really undead all the time, which isn't something you'd think you'd be able to say for such a hateful, noisy, slapdash sort of musical construction. As you could probably tell from that short little sample of their music, they also substantially upped the space rock quotient on this particular album, to the point where a lot of those long build-up sections from songs like We Hate You and Funeralopolis are even more heavily expanded on this album, particularly in the latter half. It becomes less about these big, heavy, crushing riffs and more just about the texture of the sound. Although it is still very heavy and very crushing, obviously. But like, watch right here, they're gonna get real fucking nuts. Once they get out of this counterpoint to the main intro riff of the song, you get this unfurling lead guitar chaos. I know a lot of people didn't like this album when it came out. A lot of people to this day still are not big on it. They think it's a little too loosey-goosey with the structuring and all the weird soundscapey shit. I mean, the weird droning guitar here almost sounds like something you'd hear on a krautrock album like Can or something, as opposed to proper riff-based doom metal. Personally, I love it. I remember I actually bought this album the same day that I got Pentagram's Review Your Choices and Trouble's self-titled album, and honestly, out of those three, this might seem a little blasphemous. But out of those 3 albums that I got that day, this one's probably my favorite. I'll make a statement that it isn't as heretical though, and say that at least those first 4 Electric Wizard albums, and probably the demo compilation of Lord of Putrefaction and Thy Grief Eternal as well, you need to get all of that, okay? It's solid fucking doom metal. I hope most people realize this by now, but hey, thanks for listening to me jabber about it, or watch me jabber about it, whatever the fuck it is you do, I don't fucking know. And I'll see you next time.
Foolish man. Bullets cannot harm